Good evening, folks. Good evening, good evening, good evening. This is Eddie Carson, and you are listening to Race Matters. You're here listening to Race Matters on WJOPLP Newburyport, Joppa Radio 96.3. Excited to have folks join me here as we delve into this show tonight. As we entered this show, you started off listening to Kamasi Washington, and that is truth. And one of the reasons I like it is because it's soulful, it's mellow. It allows a brother like me on my own time to sit back and ponder so many truths. I profess to be a truth teller, and that's one of the things that we're here to do. We're here to talk about race matters here in the 21st century. And what does it mean to think about and ponder race in the past and present and future? So thank you for being here. On this episode, we're going to delve into part one of a topic that's gained and garnered a lot of national attention, and that's critical race theory. Critical race theory has become really a tool in many ways for folks to weaponize arguments against conversations about race. And so the way we're going to do this is I'm going to spend a little bit of time talking about the issue of critical race theory. And so that's what we're going to do here on part one. On the next episode, we're going to delve into part two of critical race theory. We'll get a little bit more into the politics, the dissemination of information, and the challenges professed that brings about issues of critical race theory. You know, I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to start off by saying, first of all, when I talk to people about critical race theory, the first thing they tell me is, Eddie, what is critical race theory? And when I hear that, I tend to pause just for a second because I ask folks, well, I don't know. You tell me, what is critical race theory? The idea, of course, is I want people to talk about what they perceive this conversation, this topic to be about, not to sit back and listen to me inform, educate, enlighten, tell them my expertise and my knowledge and all the things that I know about CRT, and they just take that information, interpret it in their own particular way, then turn it back around and ask me different questions too. What I ask them is, well, what do you think critical race theory is? And I get kind of a plethora of answers. One of the biggest one, of course, I hear is, well, critical race theory is about making me feel bad as a white person. And that is not what CRT is about. Interestingly enough, as we'll delve into in the next episode of Race Matters here, one of the things that we're going to keep in mind is the fact that we're seeing today lawmakers, parents, think tanks, and conservative pundits essentially have waged war over how to teach students about systemic racism in this country. As of this recording, I want to say 27, maybe 28, but I believe roughly around 27 state legislatures and 165 national and local organizations have made efforts to restrict the education on racism. Don't want to talk about racism whatsoever. Let's not delve into race. As a result, school board members have been ousted. And some educators have really brought themselves to resign over the death threats, issues taking place on social media, Instagram, Facebook, and all those other things that we know about in terms of the threats that they're receiving, this bullying, harassment that they've received. So we're seeing these efforts really take place, and yet people are doing this because they're buying into sound bites. They don't really know what they're talking about, and we want to do this. Critical race theory has become so topical and problematic that I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to call out a school tonight. And I'm a truth teller, so I'm going to have to do that. An elite prep school here in New England, down in Concord, Massachusetts, by the name of Middlesex. The Middlesex School, they essentially invited a sister by the name of, well, before we get into that sister's name, let me step back and say, in terms of offering this invitation, there's a sense of rejecting folks, I should say, and rejecting folks in terms of what they bring to the table and all of that stuff too. So the sister is Nicole. Some people call her Nikki. and Nikki Hannah Jones. And one of the things that she has done, and she's really most known for, of course, is the fact that she was a professor of journalism at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill. And when it came time for her to go up for tenure, the folks at UNC Chapel Hill, they denied her tenure. They rejected it. And this shocked a lot of folks. And so the question is, well, how do you reject a brilliant sister who's done so much great work, tenure? Well, for those of you who may not know who Nikki Hannah Jones is, she worked with the New York Times. She put out the work on the 1619 Project. And the 1619 Project, published through the New York Times, really was designed to allow us to think about the role that race and racism plays in the United States. Some people would categorize it as revisionist history, essentially something beyond the master white narrative of what's taking place. And as we delve into that conversation, Middlesex offered her invitation, and then they rescinded the invitation. They disinvited her to come to their campus. This has created a lot of turmoil, a lot of conversations, a lot of things that's taken place in many ways. So we get into the question which we want to focus on today, and that is, what is critical race theory? I think the first thing we got to keep in mind here is the fact that critical race theory, it's a framework of scholarship that's put together by activists and scholars who are exploring essentially the nomenclature of race, racism, and power in the United States. They want to really talk about what are the systemic elements that drives these issues that no one wants to talk about. When we think about these activists and lawmakers, they have really centered much of their anger on a framework under the guise of CRT, though they've used it as a catch-all, for wokeness or political correctness. Some people say that this is just leftist indoctrination. The term actually refers to a body of scholarship, a body of legal scholarship where people who trained, who went to law school, they want to talk about all these things that are happening dating back to the 70s and the 80s, looked into racism, not just a result of individual prejudice. Right? Oftentimes people want to focus on the fact that, well, racism is an individual thing and individuals are racist. Going back to thinking about CRT, especially in the 70s and 80s, folks are going to step forward and they're going to say individuals don't have power when it comes to promulgating issues of racism. An individual can be racist and individuals can be racist, right? But yet an individual doesn't have the dynamic power to create the systemic issues that tend to take place. One of the things we want to keep in mind, of course, when we talk about this broad systemic elements today on CRT, critical race theory, we've got to understand that it seeks to understand and address issues such as school discipline, right? How do we track students of different colors? This whole idea of a school to prison pipeline that has become problematic. Discrimination in issues dealing with housing, employment, healthcare, for example. All of these things really look to define the structural elements of racism that work against people of color. And so that's really the focus. One of my favorite quotes comes from Brother Cornel West. And this is what Cornel West had to say about critical race theory. He said, in sense, CRT is the most exciting development in contemporary legal studies. This comprehensive movement in thought and life, created primarily, right, want to keep that in mind, though not exclusively, by progressive intellectuals, but especially progressive intellectuals of color. But yet the idea, of course, is the fact that CRT didn't just pop up. We're going to see scholars think about this going back to the 70s and the 80s, because if you think about it, by the time we get to the 1970s, we're exiting the 1960s. A period of de jure segregation, Jim Crow. And yet we're seeing some of the carryover that was really problematic for people of color. Although it came to fruition, of course, in the late 70s and the 80s, CRT was really not fully developed until, I would say, I would say 1989, maybe the mid 80s up to 1989. Some people may push back against that too. But yet, when we think about critical race theory doesn't start with folks like Derek Bell, brilliant academic whom I'll talk about a little bit later, Kimberly Crenshaw, brilliant sister who coined the term intersectionality, which is a part of critical race theory. It starts back to folks such as Frederick Douglass. Frederick Douglass is going to really start reacting to the realities and the challenges that black people in the United States face. He's going to start asking a lot of questions about the fact that what is the real progress taking place? One of the things that we know, of course, is that Frederick is going to ask or offer the question of what is to the slave the 4th of July? And really, one of the things that he's starting to do is he's starting to critique the role and the reality of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness for black people in this country. And yet, for black people in this country, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, as I've addressed before, really doesn't fit into that mold. So Douglass is asking these questions. Douglass really is looking for black folks to be a part of the country. And some people really criticize Douglass. They call him somewhat of an assimilationist at times too. I have issues with that, and I don't completely agree with it whatsoever. Cesar Chavez, talking about our Latinx, our brown brothers, sisters, and non-binary folks from south of the borders. They engaged in labor rights and farming rights issues, particularly out in the Midwest and the western part of the United States. And what does it mean to be discriminated, to have wages held against you, to be exploited? And yet, through his protests and his social movements and those dynamics that were there, one of the things that we know about Cesar Chavez is he's going to challenge a lot of that through his activist elements that are there. Like Cesar Chavez wasn't an academic, but he was an activist who engaged in that. You know, Martin Luther King. Folks want to talk about Martin Luther King every January and February. They want to post pictures up of him. They want to talk about how that brother wasn't obsessed with race. He wanted to talk about the content of people's character. But yet when we talk about King's biggest criticism really was aimed at the fact that black people had no rights. There were systemic elements that were in place against them, and no one was really delving into really wrestle with those things that are happening. When King gave that I Have a Dream speech, that Have a Dream speech was about the fact that black people would ascend beyond the challenges of systemic racism that held them back in this country. That's one of the things that King wanted to delve into. Oh, I think about some of the early days of Sojourner Truth. Ain't I a Woman? We think about intersectionality. Sojourner Truth really talked about the idea of being a black woman in the United States, being a black woman who was denied any type of political rights, particularly once we got beyond the 14th and the 15th Amendment. She was not allowed to express that in ways that we all know to be the case. You know, so as we think about CRT, what are the tenets? And I think this is a basic question that we want to get to, right? We've kind of gotten an idea of the time frame. Critical race theory didn't just start this summer when Donald Trump started talking about critical race theory, or other Republicans started talking about critical race theory. Not here to get political, but I'm a black man in America, which makes me political, which means that I've got to tell the truth. And the truth is, people became nervous about critical race theory because a couple of Republicans in Washington, D.C. started talking about how evil it is. They started talking about the fact that we shouldn't talk about racism in this country because we're post-racial. We've had a black man in a White House by the name of Barack Obama, and we've moved past this particular paradigm that's in place. We know that is not the case whatsoever. And so if we think about CRT and why we should think about it, let's think about the fact that this is something that goes back to the 70s and the 80s, and it's been around for a long period of time, and academics and scholars and activists have been wrestling with this, right? So the question for you, my gentle listeners, as you're thinking about this, is you should ask yourself, well, that's interesting. Why haven't I heard of critical race theory until this past summer? Because it became a political thing. And critical race theory, oftentimes it is theoretical, but there are actualities that are there, right? We look at the statistics based off the 2010 census that roughly 13% of this country is comprised of African American people. But yet, when we delve into issues of home ownership, we've talked about this before, we delve into issues of credit, lending, the disparities in healthcare, for example, housing, then we have to examine the system that's there. The issues of police brutality are dynamic and problematic to this narrative too. So those are the things that I want us to account for and think about as we think about critical race theory. So let's get to the tenets of CRT. The first tenet of critical race theory that people have to understand is the fact that if you subscribe to critical race theory, you believe that racism is ordinary. It is not abnormal. Racism does exist. It's pervasive within society. Oftentimes people will tell me that's a bit too pessimistic to think that there's this ubiquitous notion of racism that's there. But in fact, the reality is that racism is ubiquitous. Racism is there and it is present. And so if you subscribe to the tenets of critical race theory, you do believe that racism is a factor in society. And we're not talking about prejudice or discrimination. Not at all. We're talking about a system that is there that no one wants to talk about because, again, Martin Luther King Jr. gave a great speech in 1963, 1964, and 65, and again, right before he died in 68, and everything was solved. Everything was good. Yet we go over to Germany, for example, and one of the things they focus their attention on is really dismissing the problems of fascism and Nazism under the reign of Adolf Hitler. They've talked about this stuff. They've done an examination. They've really done some careful reflection on the problems that existed in the past. Here in the United States, the United States government has been unwilling to apologize for slavery. There are legal risks there. All right. One of the things that people are afraid to talk about are issues such as reparations. And of course, if the government admits to being a part of the challenges of the environment that promoted slavery, then they'll be held liable and they'll have to pay up. That's a threat, and that's not going to happen. I think most black people would be happy for the government just to admit this, and now let's focus on the kind of education that needs to happen to combat racism. But, you know, if we look at a state like Texas, for example, and we're going to talk a little bit more about Texas next week, the state of Texas and other states, and I mentioned about 27 state legislators who have put laws into place to ban aspects of teaching and talking about race and racism, don't want to confront the past of white supremacy. In the state of Texas, they're trying to decide what documents and what things can be studied and discussed by Brother Martin Luther King. They're saying, for example, that you cannot characterize the KKK as a terrorist group or a hate group. You can't do it. If they weren't a terrorist or a hate group, then I'm perplexed. What were they? Santa's helpers for a second? You know, people who just put on hoods on Halloween, since we're getting close to that. That's not the element, that's not the issue that's there too. The other issue, the other tenet, the second tenet, if we think about critical race theory, really boils down to what I would call the moralist arguments. And the moralist arguments delves into two categories that are there. The first, I would say, is the idealist category of the moralist argument. And this is one that a lot of people subscribe to. The fact that we've come a long way. Racism no longer exists. We've had civil rights legislation that's made things possible. We've moved beyond Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 and the 1955 ruling by the Court of All Deliberate Speed when there was no integration taking place in public schools. So those things are the idealist argument in terms of the moralist perspective. The challenge, of course, too, is the fact that this colorblind notion assumes the attitudes, the systems, the structures in place will allow us to move forward, and that's simply not the case. I like to think about the realist moralist argument. And the realist moralist argument brings us back to Derek Bell. And one of the things that he talked about is the fact that white people started to combat issues of racism through civil rights legislations, going back to Brown v. Board of Education in 1954, when it became a political topic for them. Case in point, by the time we get into the 1940s, we're really starting to see the Cold War emanate. It's really starting to heat up quite a bit between the Soviet Union and the United States. One of the criticisms toward the United States is the fact that how can you call the Soviet Union, the communist, socialist countries, all these other countries that the United States then perceive as being democratic, evil, undemocratic? They would say living in a communist regime lacked the kind of freedom that folks really were benefited and allowed to have here in the United States. But we know, of course, right? That's just not true. If you were black, if you were brown, if you were indigenous, for example, you could not attend a school with white folks. They have what they call colored schools. And the colored schools are the schools that my parents attended during the age of Jim Crow. Then you have the white-only schools that persisted. And so what we're going to see here, of course, through Bell is the fact that he's going to start saying that one of the reasons why Brown v. Board of Education came to fruition and we started to actually see some uptick in traction is because this didn't benefit white folks whatsoever. It didn't benefit white people in a sense that the arguments against this idea of American freedom and democracy was a falsity. It wasn't correct. And it wasn't really the driving force that the United States wanted to believe it was at this particular age. Realists would use the argument that through Brown v. Board of Education, through the 60s, as we move forward, we're going to start to see some systemic changes because, one, the Cold War was in place, all right? I think the second thing became about economics. And one of the things we know is if you want to bring about real changes, you got to attack capitalism at the heart. So we go back to things such as the Montgomery bus boycotts led by Rosa Parks, for example, was a model of that, Martin Luther King being a part of that. We go to Nashville, Tennessee, or Greensboro, North Carolina, where you had the segregated lunch counters. Those were problematic. So what you start seeing, of course, is black and brown people, they started saying, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to economically boycott areas that white people may not be going to. You know, a lot of white people may not be traveling on public transportation in Montgomery, Alabama. So if we don't do it, then there will be some economic consequences. So now white people starting to reflect and are thinking, okay, this is a problem here. Maybe we need to think about this civil rights stuff just a little bit because, again, right, I'm not interested in race mixing, as they would call it, but I'm also fully aware and cognizant of the bottom economic line, which is making money in order to make a living. And so that realist school of thought would say, you know what? This was beneficial. Some people would sit back and say, well, you know, Eddie, that is just really negative, and I think the United States is just growing through its ideals to be this fundamentally ideal nation for all people. Oh, yeah. You know, the only thing I'll say to that is I'm not a pessimist, but I'm a hopeful person because why get up in the morning and educate and do all the things that I want to do? But the issue that I would say here is the fact that sometimes change is not what it looks like, and change is harder to achieve and come about than we want. And again, these are just the hard things we got to look at. And CRT asks these questions, right? And they'll say, well, we got to think about the idealist argument and the realist argument here. I would throw in the next thing, of course, is that white notions are ubiquitous. Well, what does that mean? White notions are ubiquitous as a tenet of critical race theory. Everything in society evolves around the notion of whiteness. everything in society is really predicated on whiteness as being ideal. And so if there are things that benefits whiteness in society, but yet it benefits whiteness at the expense of people of color, well, that's okay. We want to focus on the ideal of whiteness, the notion, the ubiquitous element of whiteness versus the idea of making room and making space for people of color within society. People of color become somewhat of a sideshow, going back to Ralph Ellison's Invisible Man, that circus character that oftentimes was pervasive. Critical race theory really talks about this idea, of course, of the post-civil rights movement and color blindness. The fact that if you look at the military, for example, there's a lot of interracialness in the military. If you look at society, for example, we've really come to a point where you see black and white folks, whether they're now marrying interracially. Remember now, in a number of states, interracial marriage was against the law until the year 1967 in the Loving case. Think about that for a second, right? Until 1967. So in 1966, you got someone in a church down south in my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, talking about how Jesus loves us and how we should love each other and we should come together as one. Just don't date, don't marry because that Jewish brother named Jesus doesn't approve. That becomes part of the issues and the ambiguous elements that we define and we think about here. And so colorblindness is terrible. Colorblindness essentially means that, Eddie, you're going to be my friend, but as my friend, I'm going to pretend that I don't realize that you're black. We're going to be the same. We're going to be equal. We're going to be the exact same across the board. Hey, you know what? That's great. Unfortunately, that's not a reality. I want people to realize that I'm a black man in America. With my race comes culture, it comes identity, it comes experiences. It comes the experiences that my parents experienced, my grandparents, my great-great-grandparents experienced. Because we can't run from the legacy of slavery and the ways in which white supremacy has driven that past. That denial is the sinful crime of being a colorblind society. You know, I remember being in conversations or seeing this on social media, for example, which is, I'll see people, they'll post or they'll say things such as, you know, why can't we just not see color? I don't see color in my household. Everyone is the same in my household. And of course, my next question is, all right, if that's the case, that's fine. Everyone's the same color. But if I'm talking to this white family with their 17-year-old blonde-haired, blue-eyed daughter, is that still the case when she falls in love or she wants to date a black man or she wants to date a black woman, for example, right? Those are the questions that I want to know. Do you still not see color? Or at that particular point, all of the things, all of the characters, all of the provincialism that have shaped your perception of people of color come to fruition and come back to the front of your mind. And those are the dark thoughts sometimes that we go to in our head, that some people go to in their heads too. And so those are the real hard questions that people have to ask about this notion of color blindness. Am I colorblind, for example, when I see someone who looks like you, Brother Carson, walk by me and I get nervous? I get nervous because I don't know if you're a danger. We do know that the media has perceived people who look like me to be a danger, a particular danger to white women in society. So those are the elements that are there. You know, the other tenet, of course, of critical race theory that we have to keep in mind is what's called the social construction thesis. And I particularly follow and believe in the social construction thesis. As a W.E.B. Du Bois scholar, as an academic who does a lot of research, Du Bois is a historian. Alden Morris would say that he's the first sociologist to really do the type of hardcore social science research. He's going to contend that race is a social construct. Race is something that we've created for different reasons. Race is something that we've done in many ways to justify behavior and actions towards another group of people. I would call that white supremacy, and that's what W.E.B. Du Bois would call it too. So if we think about this aspect of social constructionism, I think back to how Du Bois would argue that race is something that is artificial and it can change. You know, some of the examples I'll give you. The Irish. The Irish were seen as a race, and they also, in a lot of ways, too, were part of indentured servitude here in the United States because they were seen as less than. They were not seen as white, quote unquote. My favorite example really goes back to Italians. One of the things that Italian Americans love is they love the idea of celebrating Columbus Day. And many of them push back on the idea of changing Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And part of that, of course, is that Columbus and the narrative of Columbus makes makes Italians white. You know, Columbus Day started to be embraced here in the United States in the year, I believe it was 1947. I better, feel free to double check me on that, and you should always double check me on anything I say. I'm a truth teller, but I have a point of view, and being an intelligent listener, an intelligent viewer means that when you hear something you're not sure of or you didn't know, you should double check, and should always feel free to reach out to me about that too. But one of the things we know is, as we start to see this this burgeoning conflict during the Cold War in the 1940s, America needed to create some sense of past and identity. Some of the ways they did that, of course, is in the 1940s, I think about 1947, they really started to cement Columbus Day as part of this national celebration of America. What does it mean to be an American? And in doing so, Italian Americans embraced that, because now, if you go back to the turn of the 20th century, even all the way up into the 1920s, one of the groups that was migrating here were Italian Americans. They were part of that group known as Southern Europeans. And as Southern Europeans, as they migrated to the country, a lot of Americans, a lot of white Americans created another category for them. They were seen as foreigners. They were seen as immigrants, for example. They were seen as uneducated, uncouth. They were seen as not white. But yet, come Columbus Day, all of a sudden, white people now see Italians as white. Italian Americans are no longer Southern Europeans. They're no longer Italians, but they are Italians who just so happen to be white. For black people, that's not really the case. And one of the things that's made that problematic, of course, is what's known as the one-drop rule. And I suspect many of you have heard of that. The idea that when you meet a couple that may be in an interracial marriage, let's just say they're black and white, and they have a child that is biracial, the natural element is to forget about the white side of that child and really to focus on the fact that that child is now black. The world will see them as black. A good example, of course, would be Barack Obama. Barack Obama really focused on the fact that he saw himself as a black man in America because America would see him as a black man. That being the case, Obama was raised by his white mother. Obama was raised by the white side of his family. Obama, in many ways, could claim a white, much more of a white identity, except because of the one-drop rule and the way white supremacy works, Obama cannot be allowed to be viewed nor seen as a white person in this country. He will always be a black man. The last thing, of course, really breaking away from this social construction thesis, brings us back to a term that you may be familiar with, which is intersectionality. And intersectionality was coined by a legal scholar, a brilliant academic by the name of Kimberly Crenshaw. And one of the things that Kimberly Crenshaw really delved into of intersectionality is the fact that not only if you're a person of color, you're impacted, but if you are a person of color and you happen to be female, you have intersecting identities that define who you are. And so a good example, of course, would be if you are let's step back. Let me start with my intersectional identities. On one hand, I don't have power because I'm a black man in America. And because I'm a black man in America, that means that there are elements within society. We think about really the whole prison industrial complex, and we can go on and on and on, working against me. We can talk about the media, right? We can keep going on and on in there. But yet, while I don't have some privileges, such as being black man in America, I do benefit from privileges. I'm a cis, right? Cis gender man. That's what I am. And so one of the things that happens, of course, is there's that power dynamics for the fact that I benefit through this ubiquitous notion of thinking about the power complexes that exist if I were side by side a black woman. A white man has all the privileges on the planet, mainly because he is a cis white male, unless he's gay. And then people would talk about, well, we got to keep in mind the idea that homophobia, transphobia are realities that exist too. And so that happens. If you look in the queer community, for example, and I talk to colleagues of mine, and we examine this, and friends who tell me about this, in the queer community, particularly in the gay community, it's not unusual to see gay black men in a relationship with a white gay man. And one of the things they'll tell you is because there is racism within a queer community. There is racism among gay folks, right? Because you're gay, that doesn't mean that you get to escape some of these elements that are there. But what they'll tell me is there is a power element that exists. The status, for example, of a gay black man in a relationship with a gay white man changes. It's elevated in a lot of ways. Vice versa, I would contend that in a heterosexual relationship, particularly in an interracial relationship, if someone is a white woman married to a black man, then her status does take a decline in many ways because society is going to group her in a way such as, oh, so I see you're dating a black man. Are you dating a black man because is that as good as you could get? Right? These are the hard things, and these are the things that go into people's mind. The idea that, well, she must be from the trailer park because she's dating a black man and he's not worthy of some of these elements that are there. When I was an undergraduate in college, I'll never forget, I walked out of an assembly and I made a huge fuss on campus because someone came and was talking about how this white woman had this great life going for her, and yet her life got so low, and listen to this part, that she had a baby. She had a baby with a black man, and having a baby with a black man reduced her status in society. Those are some of the things that happen when we think about the aspects and the elements of racism and what racism means. You know, as I move beyond race as a construction, as I move beyond the intersectionality of race, as we think about critical race theory here, you know, I want to bring us to the last part of our conversation today, which is thinking about critical race theory from 2 points of view. And the points of view that I've kind of gathered are folks who favor critical race theory versus those who have problems with critical race theory. And make sure you understand, right? This crosses racial lines. There are black people who do not like critical race theory. There are white people who favor critical race theory, and they understand why critical race theory is something that we should at least be talking about and why we should have conversations about race and racism in society. So let me go through a couple of these points here for you real quick, and I think we'll find some good meaning here. You know, some of the folks who would favor critical race theories would say, in part, well, it's based in merit. It's based in scholarship. There's an amorphous amount of evidence that points to the fact that there are some challenges within society when it comes to race. And essentially, if we list that evidence, much like the evidence of climate change, we can't deny it. There are factors that are reality. You know, folks would say that that CRT is real and it belongs because we need more anti-racism work and training. Critical race theory lends itself to the phrase anti-racism. And some people would push back on that. And this is some of the things that's getting a lot of buzz, particularly in terms of within conservative corners. If you are not actively working to combat racism, then you're not an anti-racist. The claim would be that you're either anti-racist, where you're working and you're in efforts to fight against racism, to dismantle racism, to dismantle systematic and structural racism, or you're a racist. There's no such thing as what? Not racist, where you get to sit on the fence and you get to choose. I think probably the most recent example would be John Gruden. John Gruden, and I must confess my heart was broken when I heard of the recent news, but I'll give you a bit of some background if you're not familiar with it. John Gruden is a longtime celebrated football coach. He is the coach of the Las Vegas Raiders. They used to be the Oakland Raiders, the LA Raiders. Now they're the Vegas Raiders. The league was looking into the Washington football team's past of climate issues, of cultural issues, of sexism, just a lot of problems that existed. And they came across an email that John Gruden had written. And essentially, he was calling a black man kind of an uppity, talking about the size of his lips and creating the characters that were there too. Well, as the league start digging more and more and more, they start uncovering not only some of the racist emails he sent, but even some of the homophobic emails about how teams shouldn't draft a person because they're gay, or some of the sexist stuff that was demeaning towards women. And all of this stuff was coming out. Before the rest of it came out, one of the things that John Gruden would say is, well, I'm not racist. I'm not a racist. So if you're not a racist, then what are you? Because to be an anti-racist means that you don't endorse, but you're campaigning against transphobia, homophobia, sexism, racism, and all those elements that are there. People will criticize and say, well, the problem with anti-racism is it's too either this way or that way. There's got to be a little bit of room in the middle. And I guess when they say there's got to be room in the middle, that means, well, you know what? I'm not a racist toward Obama. I'm not a racist toward that person. But I guess I can kind of be a racist toward that person because, you know, he's kind of like really black. And so it's okay for me to act that way, or for me to dismiss queer people, gay folks, trans folks, for example, because I don't like them. And I want to operate systemically against them, whether that means what? Not baking a cake for a same-sex couple who's looking to get married. So those are the things we have to keep in mind too. You know, one of the things that people would say, well, one of the things when I think about critical race theory that I think is problematic is they'll say, well, there's not enough data nor information. This is kind of like the climate change debate. You know, climate change doesn't really exist because I can't see climate change. So because I can't see it, I guess it doesn't exist. If I'm a white person, I don't see racism. So because I don't see racism, I guess in many ways it doesn't exist. They would offer criticisms by saying that critical race theory is just too broad, it's too sweeping, and it's not surgical enough. There is not enough specificity nor examples of this. And some people, of course, would push back and say, but yet we've given you an amorphous amount of scholarship and examples of the problems of systemic racism that exist here too. So these things are there, and these are some of the things that we have to keep in mind as we move forward. You know, I've got to say that as we think about critical race theory, we have to delve into the campaign that is at work to really inform people of misinformation about critical race theory. I think critical race theory is worth a conversation, is worth an examination. I think we need to talk about race and racism. We need to talk about the structural elements and how race and racism impacts different communities and different people. I think we can learn a lot from the Germans and how they address their past. You go to Germany, you're not going to walk around and you're not going to see memorial statues of Nazis. You're not going to hear people say things such as, well, I can't believe you want to take down this statue of Goebbels or of Hitler or some of these other Nazis because they were part of my legacy. They're part of my past. I want to celebrate them. I can't believe you're going around telling me that we can't march around flying a swastika, for example. Right? So if you're Jewish, if you're a person who is mentally and physically challenged, if you're a black and brown person, you're living in Germany, if you're Jewish, right? These are the experiences that you're not going to experience. Is there racism in Germany? Absolutely. Do neo-Nazis still exist? Is fascism still an issue? Those things are going to exist, unfortunately, and they are there. But you don't have a government defending the right to keep monuments of Adolf Hitler up. You're not seeing people defend the right to fly a swastika all over. But yet you come to the United States and people argue, well, the Civil War wasn't fought over issues of slavery. It was fought because of states' right of heritage. No, no, no. The Civil War took place because people were looking to defend their culture. People were looking to defend their economic reality. People were looking to defend their way of life, which were all predicated under the notion of slavery. And yet we still have well over 700 Confederate monuments, military bases named after them, schools named after folks. And I've said this before, if you go to my hometown of Montgomery, Alabama, 3 of the 4 major public schools, are named after slaveholders and people who fought to keep slavery in place. Robert E. Lee, Sidney Lanier, and Jefferson Davis. And yet, people don't want to talk about race and racism. You know what, Eddie? Get over your feelings. Black people, get over your feelings. If you have to walk past a Confederate flag, you know what? That flag is a beautiful flag. That flag is about culture and heritage. It has nothing to do with the fact that people want to see you enslaved or people want to demean your identity. You're too sensitive on these things. Or the fact that as we continue to celebrate Robert E. Lee, let's celebrate Robert E. Lee. Let's celebrate Jefferson Davis, for example, who was the president of the Confederacy. If we're going to celebrate MLK, white people need to have their own, tell me if you've heard this one before, white people need to have their own Martin Luther King Day, and it should be Robert E. Lee Day. So, folks, I'm going to bring us to an end. I hope that this conversation, well, if you want to call it a conversation, has been informative. There are a number of things that are here. And so as we move to the next episode next week, we're going to spend some time really delving in and focusing on the fact that critical race theory has become a political tool. And unfortunately, it's been used against white people who have great hearts and great souls, but they don't really understand what CRT means. They've heard that it's something that's bad and is evil, and they don't know how to ask the right questions. I invite you to email me, to send me a note, to ask those questions as we move forward. Thank you, people. Thank you for spending some time. This is Race Matters with Eddie Carson, and I appreciate your time. Until next week.